Everyone to week 3 of English 210. This week we're going to begin our poetry unit. And a lot of people are a little bit scared about approaching poetry because it seems difficult. But I like to tell students kind of approach poems as though they are brain teasers. And you don't read poems like you do a short story. Poems, in order to understand them, you have to go through them a number of different times. And luckily, they're often a lot shorter than short stories, so you could spend the same amount of time as you had with a short story reading it and trying to think about it as you would with a poem. It's just a lot shorter, but also can be quite denser. So this week you do have a number of readings. These two right here are informative, so I want you to read those just to get some idea about how to write about poetry, how to interpret poetry, and some of the vocabulary that consists in poetry. Over here you have a number of different poems that you could focus on in the forums. You need to definitely make sure you read at least 3 thoroughly. You also need to make sure you demonstrate that you've read the poem of the student that you've responded to in the forums. So the bulk of this week's lesson discusses how to interpret poetry. And when we say interpret poetry, we read the poem and try to figure out what the meaning is behind the poem. And we're going to learn some of the vocabulary terms. And these vocabulary terms basically should be used to help you come up with an interpretation. Because poets don't just write a poem without thinking about the rhythm and the rhyme and just have that for beauty. They put that information in there. They put a certain rhythm in there. They put a rhyme in there in order to help the reader see the theme or understand the point. Okay? And what you believe the point is of a poem might be different than someone else, and that's fine. It's your relationship with the work. Interpretation isn't just in isolation. You read the work, you develop a relationship with that work, and that relationship brings forth an interpretation. So the next section just basically discusses what can be considered a poem. And what can be considered a poem is pretty wide open. You can have, and I'm going to bring that up here in a second. Let's see. You can have, let's go one more. And one more. You can have closed poems, which are poems that basically have a certain rhyme, a rhythm, a basic certain form, that the formula that they're trying to follow. Think Shakespeare sonnets, think Frost's poems sometimes. But then you also have free verse. And free verse is kind of like I like to think of a hippie. They don't follow rules. They're just open to anything. And basically, they still have a point. They still have reasons for why this is a free verse. And yet it's definitely wide open, more so than closed poetry. It doesn't necessarily have to have a rhyme scheme. It could have a rhyme scheme or it couldn't. It could have, a certain number of syllables per line or not. So it's just very wide open. Now, cadence, this is something to remember too, is the way, if you were to say the poem out loud, it's just the way that the rhythm kind of feels within the poem. So, for example, and we're going to discuss this later on, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? See how it's kind of lilted? Or when you read Frost's poem out loud, you kind of hear that sing-songy kind of rhythm. That would be the cadence. Now the meter, and I'm going to discuss this later too, meter is basically the set, it's the beat. So let's look at shall I compare thee to a summer's day. Listen to the beats. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, right? That beat would be the meter. And again, that will be discussed later in another video. We also want you to go through some of the additional vocabulary terms this week, and because knowing these vocabulary terms will help you understand how to interpret a poem. And so when I discussed rhyme, rhythm, meter, that's all discussed in this particular video. So I really do want you to watch this video because I think it's going to help you understand how to explicate a poem. All right, so once you've read through the lesson and you've read your certain number of poems, you also need to contribute again to the weeks 2 and 3 classroom project. You just add additional posts to the short story that you've already began during weeks 2. You also have a week 3 poetry discussion. And like I said before, you need to choose at least 3 poems to answer at least 3 of these topics below. And then when you respond to your classmate, you need to make sure your response offers some sort of informative points or discussion about your classmates' poem or poems. You don't have to focus on all 3 of your classmates' poems. You can just focus on one, but you need to demonstrate that you've read the poem and that you've read your classmates' post. All right, that's it for this week. Hopefully this video helped you, but if not, please send your instructor a message or an email. Have a great week, everyone.